This is my 69th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is back to kit building, specifically my build of the Airfix Dapol Travelling Crane kit. I picked up these 7 old Airfix kits from the Kitchener train show a couple of weeks ago. All of these kits are still made and sold by Dapol, but given the choice I'd rather have the Airfix versions. For one thing, the moulds were newer when Airfix was selling the kits, so the Airfix versions tend to have less problems with flash than the current Dapol versions, which can sometimes have abominable amounts of flash. Originally these kits were sold by Airfix in boxes, which was really a better arrangement for the buyer at least. But at some point they switched to packing the kits like this in bags with instructions stapled to the top. I guess it saved money and was better for shipping and retailing. Anyway, I was happy to pick up all of these kits at the train show. I paid $40 Canadian for all 7, which was a good deal. Some of these kits I've built before. There's already a footbridge on my Hornby layout built from the Dapol version of that kit, and I already built the trackside accessories and placed the various bits from that round the Hornby layout, and I used the station accessories on my Bachmann Easy Track OO gauge layout. Of the newly acquired kits, I found this the most interesting. I've always had a fascination with cranes as well as a fascination with railways, so anything that combines cranes and railways particularly appeals to me. So I decided to go ahead with building this one. I'm afraid this kit appeared to have been packed by a particularly disgruntled Airfix employee. Many of the parts appeared to have been crudely wrenched off their casting sprues, leading to some damage, and one of the staples attaching the paper top to the bag had been driven right through one of the parts. This is the part for the front of the crane cab, and you can see here where the staple had been driven right through it. I didn't end up doing anything about these holes, as they weren't very noticeable when the model was assembled. Here's everything unpacked. Some of the smaller parts came on sprues, but most of the larger parts came separate. But as I say, they hadn't been neatly cut from their casting sprues, but rather crudely wrenched off, leaving big burrs and in at least one case ripping the part itself. Here are the instructions, pretty good as Airfix instructions usually are, an exploded diagram at left and detailed step-by-step verbal instructions on the right. Interestingly, I found the Dapol instructions online, and though they haven't changed the kit itself at all, they have modified the instructions quite a bit. However, I basically followed the Airfix sheet that I had, with a couple of departures based on my own decisions. And here are the parts. There are some small fiddly parts. Those little wheels in particular at the top right seem determined to try and escape from me. Here's a clearer view of the exploded diagram. Generally this was very helpful, though I did have at least one issue with it, as you'll see later. And here are the verbal instructions. Takes me back to my childhood and youth when I assembled many Airfix kits. In fact, today is my 69th birthday, and I received my very first Airfix kit as a present on my 8th birthday, 61 years ago today. The first step is to assemble the sides of the base with the legs that support the crane. The instructions could have been a little clearer on this. There are 2 types of sides, as seen here, with quite different grooving on their edges and slightly different dimensions. When assembling, grooves of the 2 different types should always be fitted together, that is, each corner fixes grooves of one type to grooves of the other type. Here I've glued 3 of the sides together. They don't look very good like this, but when I fit the 4th side it should bring things back square. And here are the 4 sides assembled. The top isn't square but rectangular, with one pair of sides noticeably longer than the other pair. So the top can basically only glue onto the sides one way. The little rod things seen here are referred to by the instructions as stanchions. I wasn't entirely clear about them at first, just looking at the exploded diagram. But looking at the picture on the packaging, it's clear that these stanchions are essentially posts supporting the railings around the top of the base. Now being clearer what they were supposed to be, I cut all of the stanchions from their sprues. I sanded the top of each stanchion with an emery board to remove marks from the sprue attachment, so hopefully making them look a little neater as fence posts. The stanchions were then glued all round the top of the base, with the pins on the bottom of the stanchions fitting into the holes round the top of the base. I did my best to keep the stanchions vertical. This is the part for the back of the crane cab. It came ripped in the corner like this. I did my best to glue down the ripped part, and then trimmed off the excess. These brackets go onto the back of the cab and support the back roller around which the rigging for the jib and hook will go. So first one bracket is glued in place. Then the other bracket is glued in place with the roller fitted between the holes in the tops of the brackets. I found that the holes weren't big enough for the ends of the roller, and I had to enlarge the holes a bit with the point of a knife. There's then a supporting brace that glues between the two brackets, the little sort of rectangular thing with the X in it here. So now the back of the cab is made up with brackets and roller, and this will attach to the sides of the cab. First to one side, trying to make as neat a corner as possible. Now there's an issue. The Airfix instructions point you in slightly different directions depending on whether you want to make your crane operable or to make it static as regards jib and hook position. I dithered a bit about this. Clearly the model could be made to look more completely realistic if it were assembled statically, but the idea of being able to change the position of the jib and the hook to pose the crane in different scenarios definitely had appeal. Here's the part of the exploded diagram that corresponds to those instructions. If you simply glue parts 26 and 27 in place, the internal rollers, then you won't have any ready way to change the jib and hook position. On the other hand, I wasn't very keen on the idea of just completely replacing the rollers with wire axles as suggested in the instructions. I felt that I should be able to do something with a combined approach. Here you can see the roller parts with one end of each inserted into the pivot hole in the cab side. By the way, I switched cameras in the middle of this assembly. The earlier pictures were taken with the Lumix TS30. The rest from here on were taken with the Sony HX60V. This is the base with its stanchions, which has been set aside for now. I measured the size of the pins on the ends of the internal rollers, and I found some piano wire that was of a similar size. A bit smaller was the closest I could do. I cut one end off the roller and replaced that end with piano wire. Having marked where the piano wire would come out of the cab side, I used pliers to bend the wire into a shape of a turning handle. Then the piano wire handle could be glued into the roller. Although it was a bit pointless gluing it like this, as then I had no way to actually fit it into the side of the cab. I had to take it apart again and glue it with the wire already passed through the cab side. Here I'm doing the other roller. One end is cut off, then a pin vise is used to drill a hole. Then the wire can pass through the side of the cab and be glued into that hole. Here I'm using a marker to mark where the wire will come out at the side, so I'll know where to bend the handle. And here are the two rollers with their wire handle ends fitted through the right side of the cab. Then the right cab side was glued to the cab back, with the pins on the other ends of the rollers fitted into the pivot holes in the left cab side. But I'd missed another problem here. With the ends of the rollers replaced with straight wires, there was nothing to stop the rollers slipping to the right and falling out of the pivots on the left. I got around this problem by cutting short pieces from the plastic tube of a cotton bud, then slitting these tubes on one side and fitting them over the wires, thus preventing the rollers from sliding to the right. Here you can see a clearer view of this arrangement from the top. It's a bit of a bodge, but it actually worked quite well. So now I had handles on the right side of the cab that could be used to turn the rollers. Of course, it's not realistic having handles sticking out of the cab side like that, but I thought that they needn't be very obvious when the model was finished, and it was worth it to be able to move the jib and the hook. The front of the cab has been glued in place here, and the piece for the lamp on the front of the cab is seen at top right. And here the lamp has been glued in place. The Airfix instructions actually said to glue the cab roof in place at this point, but that didn't seem a good idea to me, and indeed the Dapol instructions, which I viewed online, left attaching the roof to much later. This is the floor for the cab. A box is provided at the back for fitting a weight, as some extra weight at the back will be needed if the crane is to lift anything without falling over. I cut down a weight to fit it into the box. Here you can see the part for the crane hook. I have fixed some fine thread to it. The thread will never hang straight, unfortunately, unless there's some weight on the hook. Here, just a paper clip. I glued the cab to its base, which makes the floor of the cab, and also a platform which goes round by the door and the front of the crane. These are the pieces for the jib. They had some very nasty casting ejection marks on them. I did quite a bit of work trying to clean the parts up, but I couldn't completely eliminate the ejection marks. It's quite tricky gluing the jib parts together. It would help to have 3 or 4 hands to hold the parts together at different places whilst the glue joins set. Once one side was firmly glued to the top, I glued on the other side with a small roller at the end fitting between the holes in the 2 sides. And then the bottom was glued between the 2 sides. As I say, fiddly to get good joins. These are the brackets on which the jib mounts. They also had rather nasty ejection marks, which I tried to clean up a bit. The corner of the front platform, where the right-hand bracket is supposed to glue, came badly bent out of shape. I did my best to bend it back without breaking it off. Once the bracket was glued in place, it helped to hold that corner of the platform back where it was supposed to be. Then the other bracket was glued in place, with the pins on the bottom of the jib fitting into the holes in the brackets. It was a pity that the ejection marks on the brackets were on the same side of each, so I couldn't put both sides with ejection marks inside. At this point I tried the cab on the base, just to see how things were coming together. This little ladder is to be glued on by the cab door. Like quite a few of the parts, it needed some cleaning up before fitting. Here's the ladder, fitted coming down from the platform by the cab door. When I fitted the stanchions to the base, I thought that Airfix were being nice and providing a few extra in case you lost these small parts. But no, the remaining 4 stanchions needed to be fitted here on the cab platform, so there weren't any spare. The instructions don't say anything at all about completing the railings, but it didn't seem to make much sense just to have stanchions with no actual railings, so I glued thread round with CA glue. First I glued a thread to the middle of one of the corner stanchions. Then I pulled the thread across and glued it round the opposite corner. And so on, taking the thread all the way round. I wanted a gap in the railings at the top of the ladder, so I finished the gluing of the thread on the other side of that gap. Then I cut off the loose ends of the thread, leaving the gap at the top of the ladder. Now I had the lower railing in place all the way round. Then I followed the same procedure, gluing another thread round the tops of the stanchions. Not perfect, but hopefully this will pass reasonably for railings when the model is finished. I did the same thing to make railings for the cab platform. Unfortunately, I ended up with the stanchions a bit out of true here. I glued the cab door in place. These are the pieces that make the mountings for the wheels on which the crane will run if it is to be made up as a mobile crane. These can just be omitted if you want to make a crane that just stands in one place on its legs. These are the little wheels on which the crane will run. They're flanged wheels, as the crane is intended to run on rails and the wheel flanges need to be on the inside. The wheels fit into one side of one of the bases. Then the other side of the base is glued on, trapping the wheels pivoted between the two sides. And the other side is assembled the same. I couldn't see any difference at all between the parts for the two sides, but the wheels need to be fitted one way into one side and the opposite way into the other side so that the wheel flanges will be on the inside. I ran into a bit of an issue here. The exploded diagram clearly shows the wheel fittings as if they should be attached to the side of the base with the ladder and the side opposite to that. But the verbal instructions say that the studs on the wheel frames should fit into the angles of the legs. If you put the wheel frame onto the side with a ladder, the studs will not fit inside the legs, they'll come outside the legs. On the other hand, if the wheel frames are fitted to the other two sides, not the side with the ladder, then the studs will fit inside the legs. Oddly, the sides that have longer tops have legs closer together at the bottom, and the sides with the shorter tops have the bottom of the legs further apart. I looked at the illustration on the packet, but that really gives no help as you can't see the ladder on that illustration. However, I found a picture online of the earlier packaging when Airfix sold these kits in boxes, and here you can clearly see that the wheel frames are not attached to the side with the ladder. So I concluded that the exploded diagram was wrong and the wheel frames should attach to the sides with the legs further apart, not to the side with the ladder. Really, it makes more sense to have the studs inside the legs. And here are both wheel frames attached. At this point I temporarily tied up the jib with thread just to make painting easier. Here's the model assembled at this point. I sprayed the whole exterior of the model grey. At this point I took the crane to the layout to see where it might fit. I used some pieces of N-gauge flex track to make tracks for the crane to run on. This may not be all that sensible, but it was the best place I could see to fit the crane on this layout. Rolling stock should be able to pass on and off the turntable under the crane, although only a short engine would be able to bring a wagon under the crane, but the crane would also be able to lift a load from the road and onto a wagon on the track on the other side leading up to the turntable. It's the closest to a sensible place for the crane I could come up with. I took the crane back to the bench and hand-painted the cab brown. I did my best to paint around the various handles and brackets. I also sprayed the roof lightly with metallic silver. I painted the lamp on the front of the cab black and silver. So that was about it for the painting, but there was still rigging to do. I glued a thread to the back roller with CA. Then I passed that thread through the opening in the back wall, over the back roller, up and over the roller on the end of the jib, and then back over the back roller, and finally under the centre of the brace on the back roller bracket. I glued the thread with CA where it passed under the brace and then cut off the excess. This gave me rigging that could be used to raise the jib by turning the handle on the end of the back roller. Now I needed to rig the hook, but I realized I'd forgotten to paint the hook, so I painted it with Tamiya gunmetal paint. I glued the thread from the hook to the front roller, but I'd forgotten to pass the thread from the hook through the gap in the back wall. It's going over the top of the back wall at this point. Fortunately, I was able to just pass the hook itself through the gap in the back wall and under the back roller, and then back over the end of the jib. Then I hung some weight on the hook to get the thread nice and tight, and then I wound the hook up by turning the front roller. The rigging is now essentially complete. But I needed a load to put on the hook in order to keep its thread straight. I figured the best thing would be to use one of these container wagons. I CA'd thread under the bottom of the container in order to have something by which I could attach the container to the crane hook. With a bit of finagling, I was able to suspend the container from the crane hook. The container was threatening to tip the crane over, so I put more weights into the back of the cab. I never did glue the cab roof on, as I figured it would be best to leave it detachable so that I could get at the rigging and the weights inside if necessary. And here is the crane on the layout, making some sort of reasonable pretense of lifting the container onto a wagon. I did notice in this flash picture that I hadn't painted the front of the cab under the jib properly. Flash pictures do pick up things that you can't really see normally. I did take the cab back down to the bench to retouch the paint on the front. If you look at the crane from the right side, you can see the handles for the rollers, but I don't think they spoil things that much, and it's very useful to be able to position the jib and the hook. So I've adjusted the jib angle and the hook here so that it looks as though the container could be lowered onto the wagon. I suppose the rails on which the crane is running are a bit vague and a bit short. I had thought of cutting the flex track in half to make single rails, but for now I've left it like this. And here's a general view of the Hornby layout with the crane in place. And here's another picture after I retouched the front of the cab. It still doesn't look quite right, but I think it will have to do for now.